Good evening, all. I want to talk tonight about something we think Keir Starmer is about to do, which is to give the green light to a huge Chinese mega embassy right beside the Tower of London. Local people have protested for ages, and there are fears of underground interrogation and holding rooms in the enormous proposed complex. This morning, the Daily Telegraph revealed redacted plans which show 208 underground rooms in the proposed embassy right beside very sensitive cables, carrying private emails and messages of internet users, as well as crucial information between Canary Wharf and the city, a constant flow of private financial information and transactions right beside where Chinese agents will be sitting and presumably listening. Now, the former Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner delayed approving the embassy plan. But now the Prime Minister, who visits Beijing later this month to meet the Chinese leader Xi Jinping, seems poised to give it the thumbs up. Now, I know we're no longer much of a power in the world, and that China is the world's great rising superpower, and we depend upon China economically in all sorts of ways. But is this really sensible? Is this really necessary? It seems to me a giant security risk which touches on one of our last genuine national assets, the City of London, and I don't like the smell of it one bit. However, let's hear first from somebody who somewhat disagrees with me. That's Cindy Yu, a contributing editor at The Times. Cindy, great to have you on the show. I was very interested in your analysis because on the face of it, it looks like this is just too dangerous. It's, I think, 1.7 metres between these cables and the new embassy. What do you say?
Yes, I think that's right. Andrew, I think I would just say that it's a question of calculus. You know, if we had started at this point, if the question now was, would we sell this site to China now at this moment? I think it's pretty clear that we probably wouldn't. We'd politely say, would you consider somewhere else in London that is not so sensitive? But let's go back to the beginning of this, which is that in 2018, under the Boris Johnson government, the site was sold. Now, it seems like that government did make certain guarantees to the Chinese government that they would be approved as an embassy. Then turbulent politics happened, and now here we are, 7 years onwards, and the embassy still has not been approved. What has happened in that 7 years is that the Chinese have got more and more impatient, to the extent that President Xi himself has raised the issue with Starmer. And that, to China watchers like me, is a signal that this is such an important issue to China. And it's a question of face, because they were told that they could buy this embassy. They bought it for £255 million. And now, you know, the government, it might be reneging on that for not really any clear enough reason, other than things that, you know, have since come out to light, such as the cables. And I think it has just become such a big sticking point in UK-China relations that to renege on it now, to me, it feels like the wrong battle to be picking.
I can understand all of that. I can understand that it's hugely embarrassing. It's politically very difficult and possibly even politically dangerous to renege on it now. But if it's true that so much of our most secret financial transactions can be so easily spied upon because of this new embassy, isn't it simply too dangerous? After all, the City of London is one of the last few sort of global assets this country has.
I absolutely agree. I think in the UK's dealings with China, we have to be security first and all the other benefits and opportunities second. So fundamentally, the UK needs some red lines in terms of what are the red lines we will never want China to infringe on. That's why the Security Services assessment back in November last year is so important, I think, to my argument here, because had they not said, this is okay, we can mitigate the risks, I would not be making this argument with you here today. But what has happened is that MI5 and MI6 have given their green light. They say, okay, we have suggested mitigations, carry those out, and we think that this embassy is okay. And I think that, to me, is a pivotal point here.
Maybe I'm too cynical and too long in the tooth, but when I look at the whole process, it was very, very much shrouded in secrecy. It was an opaque process, the whole business. And when I'm told that it's all right, our security services say it can be mitigated, I am sceptical and highly suspicious about that. Perhaps you could also just remind people listening why China is so important to us. I mean, we have a trade deficit with China, but I think it's about our fifth most important trading partner, and the Chinese government's involved in Hinkley Point C and many big infrastructure projects in the UK.
So, Andrew, yes, I will do that. Just on your first point about whether or not to trust security services. I agree. I share your skepticism. But then I also think if it's not them that we're going to trust, these services who have been warning about Chinese espionage, who have hardly been dovish on China at all. Ken McCallum is out in the media every other month talking about the risks of China. Then I don't know who else we would trust. Whether or not anonymous briefings about cables is even more authoritative. So that's my feeling about that particular part of things. In terms of China's stakes here, in the short term, if this embassy doesn't go ahead, then the British embassy in Beijing will not be going ahead. And when I talk to diplomats there, they are working in outdated buildings that are actually security compromised in their own way. So they want to build a much more secure site, which Chinese are, stymieing at the moment as a retaliation.
On that, I would give you a big so what. They can carry on in their slightly stuffy and overcrammed buildings, as far as I'm concerned.
I think it's to do with security. They haven't told me much more than that, but the British diplomats I speak to say that it's about whether or not they can have the security to do their job properly in the heart of China itself. So there's a quid pro quo here. Secondly, you're right about the economic benefits. China is the UK's 5th largest trading partner. It's not the most important by any means, but smooth trade with China is clearly really, really important to the domestic agenda that any government in this country should have, which is growth. We have to start linking domestic policy and foreign policy together rather than thinking about them as separate things. If we're trying to get inflation down, or if we're trying to roll out net zero, or whatever it is, or we're trying to have more, if you've bought a new iPhone in the last 20 years, if you've bought a new washing machine, if you've managed to buy back to school clothes for your kids, all of that is beneficial because of China's role in the world system. And the problem is all of that is spread out. Right? All of the benefits are spread out and we've come to be used to it because this is the standard of living that we're used to now. But all the risks are pinpoint and really easy to point to. And so that's why I think there's a slight skewing of the cost-benefit analysis here.
Cindy, I'm not quite with you yet, but I can't think of a more persuasive way of putting the case. Thank you very, very much for talking to me tonight. And I'm joined by a Labour MP who sits on the National Security Strategy Committee and doesn't share Cindy's view, Sarah Champion. Sarah, great to have you on the show. I found the report this morning about the proximity of these very important cables and the underground rooms in the Chinese proposed embassy pretty chilling. What was your view?
I mean, you're absolutely right. It is chilling. We heard about these, I think it was the iPaper that broke the story February last year. And we've been trying to get clarification on that. And as you rightly said, the Telegraph has now exposed these redacted basement images and given us more details on this chamber. I just can't think of any other planning situation where the applicant can just refuse to give information about what they're doing. I think there are so many risks that have been raised, including by the Home Office and FCDO, that the fact that this is still being treated as a straightforward planning issue rather than a national security issue, I'm flabbergasted.
It may be that this is a question of diplomatic immunity and other embassies could do the same. Do you know, I am so ignorant about this, I don't know whether if I am less than a couple of meters away from a very important cable carrying very important information, it is possible for me, even with modern technology, to, quote, listen in or not. You're on the National Security Committee. Do you think it's possible?
Yes, proximity is definitely a massive advantage trying to spy. We also heard in the chamber today a number of local MPs to the site saying that there are plans to have the wall that is currently protecting the cables knocked down. So, yes, it's really easy. And it's not just us that are saying this. The US has expressed extreme concerns because of their financial institutes, because, of course, this information is going to our financial businesses, but also most other countries in the world share having financial institutions in the city.
So, Sarah, that's really interesting. Do you therefore think that if this went ahead, it would damage the City of London as a financial hub around the world, particularly in the United States?
100%. I mean, it already is. The US are expressing extreme concerns about this. It's unusual for them to be involved in something which our government is saying is just a planning issue. This isn't just a planning issue. This is a national security issue. I mean, the level of concern and the lack of reassurance around it is quite chilling. Cindy, as you rightly said, she put forward very persuasive arguments. One of them was that MI5 and MI6 said the risk can be mitigated. Well, any risk can be mitigated. initiated, but we have not had confirmation from the ministers that they will be conditional if the planning is given. So until we see the details of this, I remain highly suspicious. And if I'm quite honest, for not just the 700,000 British Chinese in that, but also for all of us, because, Parliament is very far from immune to the spying that's been going on from China.
That's
I'm
absolutely
worried
right.
for us.
Absolutely right. And when you look at the politics of this, there's clearly a pretty large and very, very vocal group of Conservative MPs, many of whom have been sanctioned by China because of what they said about the Uyghur issue, who've made lots of complaints, particularly about the hidden nature of the negotiations on the embassy and the opaqueness of the whole process. Is there a similar group inside the Labour Party now, or are you something of a lone voice on this?
No, there very much is a number of us that have these concerns, both concerns for our constituents. And I'm in Rotherham in South Yorkshire, but I've had the Hong Kongers that have been living in my constituency for a number of years very, very concerned, because we saw with the consulate in Manchester that protesters were literally manhandled and tried to be dragged onto the estate where the estate of the consulate, where our police would then have no authority whatsoever.
They're then on Chinese territory, we should remind
exactly
people.
Right.
Yeah.
And the Met Police have put in concerns that they will not have free access to the site. So this is a very real, very live thing. My neighbouring university is Sheffield Hallam University, and I know the lecturers there that have suffered intense intimidation from China. They're really concerned when this big mega embassy is happening. And I think the one question that doesn't seem to be answered is, why is it that China wants this mega embassy, the biggest that they will have, to be right in the heart of London? What is it about us that makes us so attractive? I would argue it's because we've been really tolerant, and that's made us really vulnerable. And I'm not hearing anything from the government that is giving me the reassurance that we are now going to stand up to this hostile state.
Your Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, our Prime Minister, I should say, is going to Beijing later this month, and he's going to be meeting with President Xi. And it would be incredibly embarrassing for him to say, I'm terribly sorry, we're not going ahead with this. It would cause a huge diplomatic incident. The Chinese would try and retaliate in whatever way they can, and it would damage very much our embassy, as we've just heard, in Beijing. Why is it worth taking that risk?
I am speaking to you as a steel MP. So we've been making steel in my constituency for decades. That's been almost completely wiped out by Chinese steel, deliberately undercutting our steel. We used to have a flourishing car industry in this country. China has systematically destroyed our car industry, and state-subsidized EVs are going to kill any future electric cars that we might produce. We're also, our renewables is completely taken over by Chinese products, most of them attributed to forced labor in China. We're systematically losing our industries and our global standing. Yes, it is going to be hugely embarrassing because President Xi is absolutely going to raise this and is going to be very, very cross. But the reality is, if we still want to have manufacturing in our country, if we still want to be recognised as law-abiding on the international stage, this is something worth fighting for. And that's what I urge the Prime Minister to do.
Time to be stand-up people. Sarah Champion, thank you very much indeed for that. Now, coming up, yet more stern words from the American president today as he calls on Iranians to keep protesting against their brutal regime. And he says help is on the way. But what could that mean? We'll discuss that later on. But the time now, 6:16.
Live on both Global Player and the new LBC app.
Well, it's 6:18, and let's talk about immigration. Thanks to stringent new rules and who can bring whom, which came from both Labour and the Tories, numbers have been tumbling. And with a lesser rise in the number of people leaving the country, some experts think we could reach net zero this year. That's not net zero on carbon emissions, of course, but net zero on people. Meanwhile, the number of raids on businesses employing illegal migrants has soared by 77% under this government. None of it's been much noticed by the general public, which thinks that immigration rose last year, when, in fact, it halved. I'm joined now by Mike Tapp, the Immigration Minister. Mike, the politics of this are, of course, incredibly important. Why do you think people haven't noticed what's happened?
I'm not sure. I think some people do gauge this by some of the illegal migration statistics. But of course, looking at the big picture on net migration, it's come down from a peak of nearly 1 million to around 200,000 in the last year. So this is a massive step, and it means that we're relying less on outside labour and foreign labour, and that of course gives opportunities to British workers. But of course we mustn't underestimate that some migration is good and important, and there are roles to fill there, but we're looking to attract the brightest and the best to the country.
And if, because of the fall in legal migration, we're not getting all the brightest and the best, and the people who would be earning large salaries and paying taxes, do you think people understand that negative migration, for instance, or no migration at all overall, might mean that the rest of us have to pay more in tax?
Well, no, because the policy changes that you've seen under the Home Secretary make sure that it's attractive to those who are looking to come over and work in those high-paid roles. So, for example, there's a shorter route to settlement for those individuals.
Any evidence
so
that's happening, though? I don't see any evidence that that's actually happening.
Bear in mind, we've only just announced this legislation just before Christmas, so that's all coming into play soon.
In terms of the business raids, I think you were on one this morning,
yes, yeah.
and we're talking about, nail bars and hair salons and all the rest of which may be using illegal migrants. Now, the number of people you can actually grab or nab is still relatively small compared to the total who will be working here illegally. To what extent do you think you can change the atmosphere so businesses become, frankly, too scared to employ illegal migrants?
Yeah, this is vital stuff. And we've seen those visits and raids up by 77%, arrests up by 83%, which shows how seriously we're taking it. And I actually spoke to one of the business owners this morning, and I know that business has been fined in the past, and those fines can be up to £60,000 per illegal worker, and they can face prison time. So the onus is very much on those business owners to ensure that they are sticking to the law. Now, this individual actually raised that in the past they've had some dodgy passports, so people have scammed their way to illegal employment, and that's where things like digital ID will actually help those employers not accidentally employ illegal migrants. So this is important stuff so that British workers aren't being undercut, and obviously will help change the look of our high streets.
Mike, you are here speaking for the British government, and so I'm going to ask you about the other huge story of the day, which remains Iran. Now, we've heard from the Foreign Secretary, Yvette Cooper, about more sanctions, though it's not quite clear exactly what those are going to be. And, the Iranian ambassador has been called in and given a talking to by the Minister Hamish Faulkner. But the one thing that we could do that would make a real difference, which is banning or prescribing the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. Everybody says that's what would make a big difference. We are not doing that. People are dying on the streets of Iran now. A very brave protester is likely to be hanged tomorrow, and we are still not acting. Why not?
Yeah, look, the treatment of the civilians in Iran is absolutely disgusting, and of course we've condemned that, and we are a world power, and our condemnation of that is important.
Please explain to me why we won't ban the IRGC.
On the IRGC, what we don't do is comment on the intelligence picture around these individual prescriptions, but what we can say is at this point we legally can't prescribe a state-linked organisation, and we are looking to change that.
So we're going to change the law if necessary to prescribe the IRGC.
Not necessarily the IRGC, I won't give that now, but of course it will open up the possibility of that in the future.
But let me I'm sorry, I'm going to stick with this because the Revolutionary Guard is such an important issue.
Yeah.
It is at least conceivable or likely that you can change the law in a way that would allow the government, if it so chose, to ban this organisation.
So that's the recommendation that we received from Casey Hall, and we're looking to implement
how quickly
that.
Can this be done?
These announcements will come in due course. I don't want to put an exact time frame up because I don't want to get it wrong,
Again,
Andrew.
People are dying on the streets, and people are looking to friends of democracy around the world, of which we are supposed to be one, to do something substantial. And quickly.
And we are a friend of the people of Iran, and what these individuals are doing on the streets is very brave, and I've got the utmost respect for them, and of course they have our support.
OK, one other big breaking story at the moment. It seems that the Prime Minister is going to abandon plans for digital ID, which was, of course, part of your department's plan for dealing with illegal working in the grey economy and the black economy. Why do you think those plans are going to be abandoned?
They're not being abandoned. We very much, I think you're talking about the mandatory checks on digital ID for working. Now, those digital checks will be mandatory. That has not changed.
So there are reports that there is going to be a big change on this. Can you tell us what is going to change?
Well, there's a lot being discussed behind the scenes, but I'm very clear on this. There will be mandatory digital checks for work, and that will help. For example, the employer that I met earlier, who had previously had to deal with a fraudulent passport they didn't know was fraudulent, so that will get around that sort of problem.
And when will those mandatory checks come?
Announcements will come in due course, but we said before the end of this Parliament.
And for the rest of us, as it were, is it still the case that by the time of the next election, we will have digital ID cards and we'll be expected to produce them or not?
The ambition is to have mandatory work checks, which will be digital, by the end of this Parliament, yes.
So there will be absolutely no U-turn on digital ID, so far as you're aware?
So as far as I'm aware, no.
All right, Mike Tapp, thank you very, very much indeed for coming in and talking to me today. Now, if you were an Iranian protester facing horrible odds as the regime cracks down, would you trust Donald Trump? Again today, he suggested he's prepared to intervene, posting, "Iranian patriots, keep protesting, take over your institutions, help is on its way." Now, as I argued yesterday on this show, I am deeply sceptical. But let's talk about this some more. I'm joined now by our Washington correspondent, Simon Marks. Simon, in Washington and around the Republican movement, do people really think that President Trump is likely to intervene?
Well, I think, Andrew, your scepticism may be well-founded. President Trump here this afternoon finds himself in exactly the position that he most enjoys being in, namely keeping everybody guessing.
Yeah.
I mean, it has been, even the last few hours, head-spinning, because we were told that the president would be hosting a meeting of his national security officials at the White House, and shortly thereafter, the Wall Street Journal started reporting that there were growing indications that the president had decided to launch airstrikes on Iran. We also saw that Truth Social posting by the president on his social media platform, urging Iranian patriots to keep protesting, saying that he had cancelled all meetings with Iranian officials until the senseless killing of protesters stops. Help is on its way. And then he even uses the acronym MEGA, Make Iran Great Again, at the end of that posting. But within the last few minutes, we've been told by the White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt that President Trump did not attend the national security meeting of his top officials at the White House today on Iran. And it would seem unlikely that he'd be going ahead with imminent military action if he wasn't even in the meeting where the options were being discussed. So this is a waiting game, and it is also a guessing game.
Simon, fascinating as ever. Thank you very, very much indeed. Let's hear now from somebody who has a wealth of experience advising the US government on relations and conflicts in the region. Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment and former Middle East Advisor to the US State Department. Aaron, thank you so much for joining me. I guess the question that everybody, frankly, around the world is asking is, what would intervention by the US look like anyway in a situation like this?
I thought you might ask what would be the purpose of intervention at a time when you have the most serious protests and demonstrations, 31 provinces, all major cities. The death count may be well in excess of 2,000.
Yeah.
More Iranian security officials, Basij IRGC, have been killed than at any point in any previous protests. Iran is weaker now than ever before. So that's the environment that you now confront. You have a president that has demonstrated tremendous risk readiness on certain occasions, striking Iran's nuclear sites, grabbing Mr. Maduro from Caracas. Question is, what kind of intervention would change the fundamental trajectory of events on the ground? My problem with what the administration is doing right now, aside from difficulties I have with Mr. Trump on the domestic side, to say the least, is he has tweeted almost daily about Iran. And the tweets have encompassed things like, we're going to intervene militarily, you're protesting for freedom, help is on the way. The options without making good on this sort of commitment. He's gone where no other Republican or Democratic president has gone on any of the protests. 2009, 2019, even in his first term, 2021, 2022. So there's an expectation, it seems to me, that the U.S. will, in fact, act in a significant way. So what are the options?
So I'm sorry to jump in, but you can't bomb your way to a democracy. You can't impose, as it were, or create a democratic outcome from this from the air, which leaves you with the possibility of troops on the ground.
I mean, that's clear. Look at any of our interventions over the course of the last 20 plus years, from Afghanistan to Iraq to Libya. The question is, given what he's done, and he's speaking in Detroit today, and I'm told he's going to talk about Iran as well, what are the options? Well, there are internet options, more Starlink, more Siphon. You can use cyber against the regime. You can essentially continue this sort of hortatory rhetorical posture. Or you could consider military strikes. Military strikes are complex because we don't have a carrier task group in the region. You can use Al Udeid and Al Dhafra, which is in the Gulf, but the Qataris, I mean, would a regime in response to military strikes use proximity to Qatar and the UAE to strike back? That's a big concern.
Yeah. Can I just...
Trump isn't out there, the Qataris are. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry to jump in, but isn't the real danger here that Trump is giving protesters entirely false hope, that the rhetoric is pumping people up, expecting some kind of cavalry to arrive in a way that's just not going to happen, and it's going to end up killing more people?
Yes. I mean, I think that's a major consequence of urging civilians who are unarmed to protest in the streets when, in fact, you do not have the capacity to protect them. Until Trump, I think, would probably see elements of the security forces and the military starting to fracture. And remember, when you count up the IRGC, the Iranian military, and the Basij, you're probably talking about a million people. And we've seen no indications that the repressive forces of security and military are going to crack. So, I mean, I think it's an increasingly fraught situation. I understand the impact to side with the protesters.
Yeah, very, very dangerous indeed. Aaron David Miller, thank you very much indeed for talking to me tonight. Now, Keir Starmer has threatened to control Grok if the AI tool on X continues to make sexual images. We're going to talk to one politician who's had first-hand experience of the damage that Grok can do. The time 6:34. You know, sometimes I think you could just ditch that thing called news, and you could rename it for our times Donald Trump Studies. The latest hand grenade from the White House has been hurled at the chairman of the US Federal Reserve, America's version of the Bank of England. Jerome Powell had fallen out with Trump, who thinks he's been too slow to cut interest rates, and he now finds himself under criminal investigation about the renovation of the Fed's HQ building. This is a form of persecution that's very rare in the banking world. But why might it matter to the rest of us? Let's talk now to the Nobel Prize-winning economist, Paul R. Krugman. Mr. Krugman, thank you very much indeed for joining me tonight. Central bank governors around the world have written a letter protesting about the treatment of the Fed's chairman. Why do you think this is such a big issue?
Well, the first thing, leaving aside the special monetary policy has special features. But first of all, you have here a government official, that's basically what Powell is, trying to do the job that legally he is required to do. And the Trump people are trying to intimidate him with by bringing spurious criminal charges. I mean, this is an insane thing. This is not something that we're supposed to be doing in the United States of America. This is like a dictatorial. Next thing we're going to have show trials. Then on top of that, we have a special situation when it comes to central bankers, whether it's the Bank of England or the Federal Reserve or the ECB, which is that this is a policy tool that we know is all too frequently abused by governments. It's very hard to avoid. The temptation to cut interest rates ahead of the next election is always very strong. And we've learned through generations of experience that the way you deal with that is by giving the Fed, the Bank of England, substantial short-run independence. In the long run, they're answerable to the voters, but in the short run, we charge technocrats with making monetary policy. And this is it would be a big deal if Trump was overruling that independence on its own. To do so with kangaroo courts and a politicized Justice Department is completely over the pale.
Well, I'm old enough to remember very vividly when Gordon Brown made the Bank of England independent here for exactly those reasons. And I guess the question is how the markets will react if they decide that actually monetary policy in the United States is driven now from the White House, not from the Fed. Because I know in the past, Donald Trump has called its governor a loser and a numbskull and all the rest of it. He's used the abuse. And after the abuse, that hasn't had an effect. He's now gone for something much more dramatic.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of a Thomas à Becket thing. Will nobody rid me of this meddlesome central banker? But there's a lot of hurdles before Donald Trump can actually take over U.S. monetary policy. But it is amazing. This is something, previous administrations have always been very cautious, even when they didn't like what the Fed was doing. They've been very cautious about putting pressure on, or even appearing to put pressure on it. This is just utterly, the markets have so far kind of shrugged it off, believing that in practice they won't be able to do it, that Trump will not be able to order the Fed to cut interest rates. If and when they start to think that it's real, we have the closest recent parallel is Turkey, where Erdogan, the Trump-like president, did politicize the central bank, and inflation went up to 80%. So, it take a lot to get the U.S. There's a great deal of ruin in the United States economy, but you could do it. And so at some point, if this keeps on happening, markets will react. But so far, they seem to actually, if anything, the craziness of this thing probably strengthened Powell's hand for the time being.
We have to learn to take your president literally sometimes as well as seriously. I'm thinking about Greenland, for instance. In this case, if Mr. Powell ended up, in manacles in the dock, being charged with a criminal offence over what he said in Congress about the HQ of the Fed, and was then, even less likely, I concede, convicted, what does that do to the world's reserve currency?
Oh, the only thing right now, given the craziness, again, of U.S. policy, the only thing that sustains the dollar is the lack of alternatives. Which is a big factor. It is really, really hard. In some ways, the role of the dollar is a little bit like the role of English as the international language. Really, really hard to displace. So there's a lot of weight of history, a lot of sort of self-reinforcing patterns of transactions that make it hard to ditch the dollar. But nothing is permanent. Nothing is immune. If you run the United States as if it was Argentina, then sooner or later the dollar stops being the dollar.
Paul Krugman, a happy little honour to have you on the show tonight. Thank you very, very much indeed for that. Pressure is mounting on the government to follow the lead of Australia and implement a total social media ban for under-16s. Could Number 10 go with that? Our deputy political editor, Aggie Shornbury, is with me now. Aggie, this has been a new kind of signature policy from the leader of the opposition, Kemi Badenoch. Is it really possible that Number 10 could go the same way?
I think it's very much possible, Andrew. I think there have been many in government who actually have been pretty keen for this for quite a while. And a few things have happened recently. One is that Australia have done it. And I think ministers are watching very, very closely what happens with that. In fact, there's been the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, and the Technology Secretary, Liz Kendall, have both separately asked for advice from officials on basically how that was implemented, what that policy actually looks like, and fundamentally how that is working. So they are both separately waiting for advice back on that. And then, of course, as you mentioned, Kemi Badenoch has also separately called for that to happen. And as soon as she did that, one Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, also said, I think this is a brilliant idea that Kemi Badenoch has. I'm paraphrasing there. And I think that really...
It's a very popular idea in the country as well, isn't it?
It's hugely popular in the country. And actually, the Prime Minister was asked about it yesterday at a private parliamentary Labour Party meeting. And one Labour MP who was there described what he said as, look, no one disagrees that you should get kids off phones, but it is just how you do it. And the MP in the room told me that the way he saw that was, we are going to do something, and we're going to do something soon. Liz Kendall, the technology secretary, did say publicly yesterday that it was not currently the government's policy, but did say that we will be driven by the evidence. Government sources do, though, point to the fact that there are groups outside of government who don't think it is the right move, and they don't agree on what exactly the right move would be, like the NSPCC and the Molly Rose Foundation.
A very, very big story. And Aggie, since I've been on air, another very, very big story has emerged. There's a report in the Times that the government are going to do a U-turn on digital ID, and I think the Times say it will be their 13th major U-turn. Now, I asked Mike Tapp, the immigration minister, about it, and either he didn't know about it or he was determined to stop it, because he said, absolutely not, that's not happening. What are you picking up? I know it's very early days.
Well, what the government is saying, what Number 10 is saying, is we will have compulsory digital right-to-works checks. But that doesn't necessarily mean that those are going to be from a mandatory digital ID card. So it does seem like the Times reporting is correct that these
So there
plans,
is a U-turn, that's...
It looks like there's yet another U-turn. That's right, Andrew.
Wow.
So the plans for the mandatory digital ID cards for workers, basically that part of it could be ditched, but Number 10 is still saying they will still have compulsory digital right-to-works checks. And they basically think that the conversation was getting overrun with the idea of what those digital ID cards would look like. And so they are ditching, it seems, that part of it. But fascinating that Mike Tapp denied that to you.
I think this is what we call technically a wibble-wobble moment. Aggie, thank you very much indeed for that. Now, we've been talking a lot recently about the sexualized image making of Grok, the Elon Musk AI tool accused by ministers of promoting child pornography. One leading critic of all of this has been the Labour MP for Lowestoft and NHS advisor on violence against women and girls, Jess Asato. As a kind of punishment, humiliation, presumably, she was portrayed by X wearing a bikini, and she joins me now. This was intrusive, Jess, and clearly meant to be an aggressive response to what you've been saying.
Yes, and thank you for inviting me on, Andrew. It's the sort of thing that I expected to happen to me quite a while ago, because, of course, these nudification apps that you can upload women's photos to have been around for a really long time. And that's why I mounted a campaign in autumn 2024 to persuade the government to ban the apps and the features within them, which they announced brilliantly just before Christmas in the Vogue strategy. Of course, at the same time, we saw that growth of Grok AI, where users were able to request the nudification of women and really dreadfully children, which is in itself illegal child sexual abuse material. And as we came into the new year, as somebody who's vocally campaigned for nudification app ban, I clearly got into the firing line. And yes, there have been a number of pictures of me which are unseemly and distasteful. They're not as bad as many women have faced, which have been absolutely horrific. We hear
it must
pictures
make you
of blood
feel sort of
bruising.
dirty and demeaned.
Yes, it's humiliating. In fact, that is why mostly men do it, and 99% of images uploaded to nudification apps are of women and girls.
So, I mean, I mentioned the word porn there, but it is as much a form of kind of intimidation as anything else. Power.
It is power and control, and the effect that it might have on women anywhere, but particularly in terms of public figures, is that we will self-silence. And many of the commentators have said, if you can't take the heat of us, then get out of the kitchen.
Get back into the kitchen.
That's right, and get off the platform. And you know, it's not a space for you, clearly, because you're too fragile. Well, I think the vast majority of the public actually would understand this to be disrespectful and demeaning, and not something that we should be experiencing in any walk of life.
When Ofcom got onto this a bit over a week ago, Grok eventually responded, or Elon Musk responded, by saying they're going to limit this power on Grok to subscribers. In other words, you have to be paying their money and then you can do it. Is that enough for as far as you're concerned?
I mean, it doesn't solve any problem. It just means that you're paying to sexualise women and potentially even children, which in itself is illegal. And of course, Ofcom is mounting an investigation. That's not right. And we don't even think that's necessarily the case. Many people have said they've been able to create these images without having to pay anything to XAI.
One very quick question. I get the sense that Number 10 and Keir Starmer in particular are genuinely furious about that. Is that your sense too?
Oh, we've absolutely heard that condemnation from the Prime Minister, from Liz Kendall yesterday, and frankly the government has really moved very, very quickly to bring forward legislation that would help to prevent this.
Jess Sato, thank you very much indeed for that.
Thank you.
Now, coming up, have you got a diesel car? Are you driving in one right now? Well, I'm sorry to say there could be bad news coming, and we'll bring that to you in a few minutes, but the time now, 6:46.
Coming up at 7 on LBC, Ian Dale.
At 9, should cousin marriage be banned? Cross question at 8. But first, if you were an Iranian and in Iran, what action would you be taking?
Ian Dale at 7. Listen on our free Global Player app or the new LBC app.
For the nappy.
Britain's Conversation, LBC, tonight with Andrew Marr.
6:48. In times as turbulent and unstable as these are, it's very easy to fall into the trap of pining for the good old days. But were those old days really all that good? That's something explored by the author and historian Alwyn Turner in his excellent new book, A Shell-Shocked Nation, Britain Between the Wars, and he seems to have found far more parallels than you might think. We started by talking about political instability in the early 20th century, when Britain had 4 prime ministers in just 2 years.
Yes, we came very close to it recently, didn't we?
Yeah, we did.
It does seem an odd parallel. A century apart, we're going through the same thing, and that same business of trying to fit in more parties than the system is really designed to accommodate.
The splintering of parties. In your case, it's the old Liberal Party breaking up in different directions. It's challenges to the Labour Party from Oswald Mosley and the new party, and even the Conservatives are divided between free traders and anti-free traders.
Yeah, and the great story of the interwar years is that the Conservatives do still manage to hang together despite those disagreements. 6 general elections between the wars, and the Conservatives get the largest share of the vote in every single one of them. Despite everything that's going on, the Tories, the old secret of unity is still there.
Unity is still there. Today's story should take note. And when it comes to cultural life, again, huge similarities, because those political leaders are trying to deal with a new world, which in the 1920s is the rising world of the popular newspapers and the press barons who hate them. And it does feel a bit similar to Keir Starmer and Elon Musk or whatever.
Mm-hmm. In the 1920s, it's Lord Beaverbrook at the Daily Express, Lord Rothermere at the Daily Mail. And they have great political aspirations themselves, and
just slightly nuts as well.
Yeah, and Stanley Baldwin has to face them down, and does so incredibly effectively. And no talk of banning them. We take them on in an open fight and win the battle of ideas, and he does.
And if we today are getting used to the American influence through social media, this massive cultural wave of influence coming from the United States, again, in Britain between the wars, it was really the films. And you've got a wonderful vignette when you point out that, of course, until the talkies arrive, British film audiences have seen American actors, but they've never heard them. They don't know what Americans sound like.
No, there's all these great stars that they've encountered, Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford. We know what they look like. We've been watching them for years and years, and then suddenly they open their mouths and speak, and they've got this very funny voice because, of course, virtually nobody in Britain has ever been to America. They've not met an American. They don't know that people can speak like that.
And film audiences roar with laughter in the wrong places.
Yes, indeed, yeah. And reciprocally, there are stories in America of them seeing British actors speaking in this funny voice that they don't understand as well.
Is this a period when culture becomes steadily more passive? I'm thinking of your earlier book about the Edwardians, and in the music halls, people are still singing along and shouting back, and there's a certain amount of give and take. And of course, with the film, there's none of that.
Yeah, once you get into things being recorded, you've got the gramophone record and you've got movies. And also radio, although that's live, it's still, you're removed from the audience, or the audience is removed from the broadcaster. It does change the nature of how people experience their cultural moments. And there is a certain amount of pushback on that as well, which I think we also see now, where you get the massive rise of community singing. The Albert Hall is packed out because the Daily Express is running one of its community singing evenings, and everybody joins in. People want to join in the same way that I think you get now. That it's one of the reasons why social media is so powerful now, is it gives people the sense of belonging to a group. Even if you're atomised and you're separate.
They can film themselves, they can record themselves.
Yeah.
And also, in terms of the sort of underlying social anxieties, in Britain between the wars, there's a lot of anxiousness about the relationship between the older generation, particularly the ones who fought in the war, and the younger generation, who for a lot of people have been somehow cut out of society and ignored.
And feel that somehow they're not being valued at all because they weren't there. It was something beyond. And they respond sometimes in a fairly aggressive way that, so much for you then. We're off on our own.
At the Oxford Union, they famously vote not to fight for king and country.
Indeed, and that's only a few years after the general strike, when Oxford students were busily coming out and manning the emergency crews on the buses and acting as drivers for transport and so on. There was a change there where pacifism became very big.
When I sort of jumped into your book, I felt very quickly that I was in a familiar world where there was, as it were, quite radical challenges from the left, quite radical challenges from the right, and a kind of middle class desperately hanging on to the old order, not very successfully.
Possibly, but it does also have the advantage, I think, that time of figures like Stanley Baldwin, who is just, the dominant political figure of those years between the wars. He's Prime Minister 3 times, and even when he's not, he's often the power behind the throne. And he maintains a sense of authority, which I think is what we're possibly missing now.
That's really interesting, because I was going to say he's a bit like Keir Starmer in tweeds and a pipe. And the answer is no, because he has a solidity and a background that Keir Starmer doesn't.
Yeah, and he's been around for a long time. Even before he gets to be Prime Minister, he's established himself in business. He's been in Parliament, he's been in the Cabinet. He knows his way around the political system, and he knows his way around the country, has a feel for the country that I'm not entirely sure that Keir Starmer does.
This is a history book, so I'm not going to look for sort of strong kind of messages from you from today, because you're a historian. But I felt a paradoxical sense after reading this book. On the one hand, I felt quite reassured. Lots of the problems we have, new media, problems with authority in politics, parties splitting, war going on between the generations, there they all are in the 1920s and 1930s. We've been there before, so we can do it again. And then I thought, but there was the Second World War afterwards.
Yeah, there's hopefully we don't have to resort to such measures, but there are very strong parallels. That campaign. The reason the Tories are split is over the issue of tariffs. Something that's had disappeared for decades from our political conversation. It is now with us again.
Alwyn Turner, it's a very, very enjoyable book indeed. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you.
Now, if you've got a diesel car, this news might make you worried. If you haven't, if you've got an electrical or petrol car, it'll probably make you feel a bit smug. So here goes. According to an electric vehicle think tank, some filling stations in London will stop selling diesel by 2030. And by 2035, many stations across the UK are expected to have scrapped it. Let's talk to Tanya Sinclair, the CEO of Electric Vehicles UK. Tanya, I think you're in the back of our car, which I'm assuming is electric, and that's very appropriate. Can I ask you if this research is kosher? Because it does come from the electric vehicle world, and therefore it might be propaganda against diesel and petrol cars.
Well, good evening, and I am indeed coming to you from my electric car. This research, it was published by a think tank called New Automotive, who are completely independent. And Electric Vehicles UK exists to communicate the realities of electric driving to people who are interested. And this research is very extenuating the existing trends that are happening with diesel right now. There's no propaganda and there's no information.
I did have to check. I did have to check. Am I right in saying that diesel vehicles are coming down in numbers quite quickly at the moment?
Yes, they are, but that's not uniform across the country. What we're seeing is that trend being more pronounced in London and, interestingly, in Scotland, in the central belt of Scotland. But the rest of the country, there are a slower decline of numbers of diesel vehicles. And interestingly, with vans, the numbers are rising.
Well, of course, for a long time, it was the cheaper option. I'm not sure if that's still the case. How close are we to that tipping point where there are so many electric charging points that it actually becomes easier to charge an electric car than it is to fill up a petrol or diesel car?
Well, I would say that time has come right now, because every plug point has the potential to generate electricity that can charge your vehicle. And if you are lucky enough to have a driveway, which I accept that many people don't, that your home is also has the capacity to be an electric car charging point as well.
One quick final question. Electric cars have, become very, very popular, but an awful lot of them are Chinese made. One of my earlier guests on the show was saying we have basically given up the electric car industry to China, and they will destroy any chance we have of building our own. Is, candidly, that true?
Well, in addition to many new brands coming from China to the UK with highly efficient, well-performing, competitively priced vehicles. There's also under the bonnet your components and so on, which are also Chinese. But I don't think that's anything to be concerned about, because we also have a robust manufacturing industry, and we have global competitiveness and a supply chain and the ability to trade vehicles, parts and components globally from across other markets. All
right, Tanya, thank you very, very much indeed for talking to me. Tomorrow, I'll be joined by the former boss of the CIA, John Brennan. So do please tune in for that. Should be fascinating. And if you've missed any of today's show, you can listen back on our free Global Player app or the new LBC app, where you can read and watch the latest from LBC. You can put your news categories in the order you'd like them. You can pause, you can rewind live radio and listen to a range of podcasts. Download the all-new official LBC app for free from your app store now. Coming up at 10 on LBC, Henry Riley. But right now, it's time for Ian Dale.
Thanks, Andrew.